Hi, fifth grade. Today we're going to be reading Lunch Money, Chapter 8, and this chapter is called Two Down. When Greg got to Mr. Z's room after school on Thursday, no one else was there. He sat at a desk in the front row and looked over at the clock. It was already 3:05. Greg thought, 6 minutes. If he's not here in 6 minutes, I'm going to soccer. A minute later, Maura burst into the room. Sorry, I know I'm late, but I... Then she saw only Greg was there. She stopped and then walked to the front of the room. I thought I was late. You are late, said Greg. He jerked a thumb toward Mr. Z's desk. Just not as late as he is. A minute went by. The empty school felt too quiet for Greg. He said, so what's he want to say to us anyway? Without turning her head, Maura said, 3 guesses. Right, said Greg. Then he remembered what Maura had said about his comic book. It was okay, but... Greg wanted Maura to finish the sentence. Then he thought, why do I care what she thinks? But after another minute of silence, his curiosity won out. Still, he didn't want Maura to think he actually cared what she thought. Then he hit on a way to bring up the subject. Greg said, I read your unicorn book. It was good for what it is. Maura turned to face him, arching one of her pale eyebrows. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, said Greg. It's not really my kind of story, that's all. You know, princesses and unicorns. I like comic books, and your book isn't a comic. So, why'd you read it? Greg shrugged. It was the only reading material I had in the nurse's office. I was bored. How come you read my story? Maura tossed her head. Same reason. There wasn't anything better to do in math. But you bought a copy of mine, and you said it was good, right? Yeah, Maura admitted, but that's what Greg had been waiting for. But what? What didn't you like about it? Maura was quiet a moment, and when she spoke, Greg saw she was choosing her words carefully. Well, it's sort of like what you said about my book, about it not being your kind of story. See, I know you want to try to sell a lot of copies. Greg interrupted, because you think I'm a greedy little money grubber, right? Maura's eyes flashed. Can't you just listen? Greg nodded, and Maura continued, I liked the story, and I liked the artwork too, but I don't think many other girls would. And since half the kids at school are girls, if you write boy stories, you're only going to sell half as many books as you could. Greg pretended to look shocked, and then shook a finger at Maura. Boy stories? I'm going to tell Mrs. Sanborn what you said. Mrs. Sanborn was their social studies teacher, and she talked a lot about equal rights for women and girls. She got furious whenever someone suggested that men and women, or boys and girls, should be treated differently. Maura said, Don't be dumb. I'm not talking about equal rights. I'm talking about what girls like and boys. And no matter what Mrs. Sanborn says, most boys don't pick stories about princesses, and most girls don't pick stories about cavemen with spears. As Maura finished that sentence, Mr. Z walked in. Cavemen with spears? Are you two calling each other names again? Maura and Greg shook their heads, and Mr. Z said, Good. I was delayed in the office. I was afraid I'd get here and find you two wrestling on the floor or throwing chairs at each other. But you're not name-calling and not fighting. Looks like progress. He pulled a front-row desk forward a few feet, turned it around, and sat down midway between them. Mr. Z had been planning that he would say to Greg and Maura all afternoon. He already knew exactly where he wanted this meeting to end up, but he was prepared to take his time getting there. In his mind, it was like a math problem. He would add right ideas, subtract wrong ones, divide fuzzy thinking by pure logic, and the children would nod and smile at one another as peace and understanding multiplied itself. Looking first into Maura's face and then into Greg's, Mr. Z said, Now tell me precisely, what started this mess during 6th period? Greg, you first. Greg took a deep breath and then let it out slowly. Well, it really started at the end of lunch period. That's when I found out Maura was selling these little books like mine, ripping me off. I did not rip you off. Maura. Mr. Z raised a warning finger. Quiet, your turn's coming. Maura nodded, but kept on talking. He just said a minute ago that my story is nothing like his. Yeah, said Greg, his voice rising, but it's still a mini-book, right? Admit it, you ripped me off. Quiet, both of you. Mr. Z was not used to raising his voice. I am not going to put up with this. If you two can't talk this out with me, then I'll turn the whole matter over to Mrs. Davenport and your parents. He looked from Maura to Greg and then back again. Is that clear? Now, I asked Greg to speak first, Maura. Not another word. Turning to Greg, he said, So you found out Maura had these booklets for sale, and you got mad. Anything else? Well, said Greg, Just that it didn't seem fair. It was my idea. So yeah, I got mad and I came to class that way, and you saw the rest, and that's all. Mr. Z nodded and said to Greg, "Okay, now it's your turn to listen, not one word." Turning to Maura, he said, "Let's hear your sides." Maura shrugged. "There's not much to tell. I mean, what did I do? I was sitting here in class, and he comes blasting in and starts shouting and throwing stuff in my face, and me hitting him, that was an accident. He said so himself to the nurse. So I didn't do anything." Greg pushed a puff of air between his lips. Not a word, but close enough to draw a glare from the math teacher. Mr. Z turned back to Maura. "Show me your little book. Do you have one?" Maura zipped open a pocket on the front of her backpack, pulled out a copy of The Last Unicorn, and handed it to Mr. Z. He quickly turned the pages, scanning the text and looking at the pictures. Then, turning to Greg, he asked, "And how about yours?" Greg took a copy from his pencil case and handed it over. Again, Mr. Z did a skim. Looking up from Creon's face to Greg's, he said, "So even though these are clearly very different items, you're still mad that Maura did something similar, right? Use the same idea?" Greg nodded. "Right, my idea." Looking Greg in the eye, Mr. Z said, "So you agree with me that a little book with pictures is an idea?" "Yeah," said Greg, "of course. Like I said, it was my idea." Mr. Z shook his head. "That's not what I said. I said a little book with pictures is an idea, not that it is your idea." Then, holding up both mini books between his thumb and index finger, he said, "These two different things are still just one idea, right?" Greg nodded. "Right, and the idea was mine first." Mr. Z leaned forward. "But the thing about a true idea is that no one can really own it, even the person who uses it first. In mathematics, the Sumerians were the first to use the idea of place value over 5,000 years ago, but they do not own that idea. And when you sit here in my room adding large numbers and you carry tens or hundreds over into the next place value column, does a Sumerian come running into the room and say, 'Hey, quit it, that's my idea'?" Greg didn't answer. He lowered his eyes and stared at the smear of green gum on the floor. Mr. Z went on, "Now, if Maura had used a character, this Creon guy, or she had made her drawings look just like yours, then I think you have more reason to be upset. But she didn't do that. She used an old idea, a small book, in her own way. And yes, she may have seen you do it first, but that's the way ideas work. They spread. So I don't think you should be mad at Maura. If anything, you should feel flattered. Someone thought the way you used an old idea was so new and interesting that she wanted to try it out for herself." Mr. Z paused. Greg was looking down at his feet, studying his sneakers. He decided to just let Mr. Frizzyhead talk himself out. I argue, the sooner this guy finished yakking, the sooner he could leave for soccer practice. "Look at me, Greg." Greg tipped his head back. He flicked his eyes to the teacher's face and then back to the floor. The math teacher said, "Is any of this making sense to you?" Greg shrugged. "Sure, I guess so. Then, I think all this adds up to one thing." Mr. Z paused, waiting for Greg to look him in the face. It didn't happen, so he said, "Greg, you need to apologize to Maura." Greg's head jerked up. "Apologize? Me? No way." Maura knew how stubborn Greg was, and she liked the talk that they had been having before the teacher had arrived. She quickly said, "It's okay, Mr. Z. He doesn't have to apologize." Mr. Z said, "Yes, he does. First, he has to apologize to you, and then he has to apologize to me for making a huge disturbance in my room and wasting precious class time, and all because of a comic book." Greg felt the fury rising in his chest. He wanted to tip his head back and howl like a Creon. He wanted to get up, close to this man's huge nose, and shout, "I'm the guy with the black eye here. I'm the one who had this idea ripped off. Apologize? That is so stupid. No, actually, you're stupid." Greg felt his face getting red, felt his heart pounding, and then, for the second time in one day, Greg felt his nose begin to bleed. Only this time, it was a real gusher. Blood streamed out of his left nostril, over his lips, and dripped off his chin, spattering his shirt and the desk. Mr. Z put one hand over his mouth, and with the other he pointed a shaky finger, his eyes wide. Oh, you know, it's, but he couldn't even say the B words. Mr. Z's face went pale as paper, sweat stood out on his forehead, and behind the hands still covering his mouth, his breath came in gasps. Earlier, Greg hadn't noticed Mr. Z's reaction to blood. This time, he couldn't miss it, and he decided to enjoy it. Greg leaned forward and nodded at Mr. Z, making no effort to stop the flow. Yes, my nose is bloody, very bloody. It's bleeding and blood is getting all over the place. Bloody, bloody bloods. Mr. Z turned away, almost throwing up. Greg, Morris snapped. Stop it! That's mean. She already grabbed the tissues from the teacher's desk. Here, and she pushed the box into Greg's hands. Turning to Mr. Z, she said, Can I get you some water? Mr. Z shook his head. I just need to lie down. And with more to steady him, he eased out of the desk and onto the floor, flat on his back. Eyes closed. Now you, Morris said to Greg, sit on the floor and lean forward and squeeze your nose hard. Greg followed orders, but then decided he'd be more comfortable lying down. Morris said, I'll get the nurse and a cold pack, 2 cold packs, and she left Greg and Mr. Z littering the floor of room 27. And that is the end of chapter 8.